Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Andrés Spokoiny. He is the president and CEO of Jewish Funders Network, an international community of private foundations and philanthropists with more than 2,500 members from 11 countries around the world, whose mission is to promote meaningful giving and take an active part in the processes that change the thinking and action patterns of philanthropy in the Jewish world. He is a longtime Jewish communal leader with a history of leading successful organizational transformations, serving as the CEO of Federation CJA in Montreal. And prior to that, he worked for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Community in Paris. Enjoy my conversation with Andrés Spokoiny. Andrés, how are you? Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you doing this. I know you're a busy guy, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've been following you for a long time, and so I'm really curious to hear and pick your brain about a few different topics. But let's start with your background, where you're from. I hear the accent. I'm sure you'll tell us where you're from and also everything that led to where you are today.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I don't know what accent you're referring to, but I've heard in the past that people say I have an accent. I think it's they who have an accent. But anyhow, I did start my trajectory in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. I grew up there, and I think that growing up there had a lot of influence in who I am today and what it made in many different ways. So first of all, I grew up during the time of the generals. It was 70s and 80s. It was a time of enormous repression, big anti-Semitism, a pure dictatorship, and the Jewish community for some reason became both a refuge and a place where you could do many of the things that were forbidden in the outside. And I remember, for example, we would meet up at the Jewish community to see forbidden movies or to read forbidden books, or just to have open conversations where you could say what you were thinking, right? So this notion of the Jewish community being the place where you can see who you are and realize yourself and be free and have a warm space when the outside is so cold and violent stuck with me. And I think in a way it sort of made me who I am. And it also gave me a very big understanding of how the Jewish intersects with the secular. So for example, one of my teachers there, as many Argentinian Jews, was Rabbi Marshall Mayer, who was an American rabbi, from the vintage of the 60s and the civil rights movement, that then goes to Argentina and finds himself in the dictatorship and takes upon himself to fight for human rights there and talking about political prisoners and the development of Judaism, of conservative Judaism specifically, in Argentina went hand in hand with the development of a consciousness about human rights and social justice and stuff like that. So I learned from very early on to see secular issues through a Jewish lens. And last, but certainly not least, as many people that grew up in Buenos Aires, our education system, our Jewish education system was very, very, very Zionistic. I discovered Jewish quote unquote religion later on. The beginning was socialist Zionism, right? And only later it added the religious component. But it was something that now it's lost in that community all around the world. But we were totally bilingual, Hebrew and English and Spanish, sorry. Israel was extremely present in every aspect of our lives. I only joke that I could name the streets of Haifa before I could name the streets of Buenos Aires.
So how do you go from growing up in Argentina to running Jewish Funders Network?
So interesting. So in a way, so I think that involvement with Jewish community like gave me a lot of meaning, a lot of satisfaction, and I went to Israel, studied there, lived there. I had and then at some point, as anybody who's like working in the Jewish community feels that they need to have a real job. So I started working in the corporate sector too, and I was working in IBM, and then at some point, somebody enticed me to go back to the Jewish communal life and to work for the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, in a time that the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe were emerging out of the long communist night, and they needed to rebuild. And it was supposed to be a 2-year stint helping those communities stand on their feet, and 2 years became 12. And then when I realized I was deep inside in Jewish communal life, and that became my life. And then I worked as the CEO of the Jewish Community Federation of Montreal, which is a fascinating experience, because that was a community, very traditional federation, one of the most successful federations in North America, but one that really needed a strategic revisioning in a way. And so that was my job, to go and try to help them reimagine the community of the future. And then I got recruited to do the Jewish Founders Network. And I said, this is not for me. This is just, holding hands of rich people. That's not what I want to do. But then I realized, no, wait a second. This is just amazing. This could be a fascinating platform to do all sort of things, because you're really working with folks that have the influence and the wherewithal to do real change in the world. And that's what I've been trying to do ever since.
So you use an interesting word there, trying to do. And I think a lot of people look at you in your shoes and the relationships that you probably have with people that have a lot of resources and financial resources and otherwise, and they say, why aren't you doing more? What do you say to that?
It depends. Why I'm not doing more, or what the funders are not doing more?
Well, I think that, you speak very candidly about, I've been referencing your latest speech from the conference, your last conference here in 2022, in which you used some pretty dramatic language. I think it's warranted, by the way. I don't think it's over hyped by any means, but I think that at the same time, I think a lot of people would say, well, you have all these relationships, you talk about adult education, for example. I know you're big on that. Well, again, maybe we're not seeing this, maybe it's more behind the scenes, but again, from the outside looking in, for example, if somebody reads that article, or it was an article, but if somebody hears your speech, which is on YouTube, and was turned into an article, and says, well, wait a minute, you're the head of the Jewish Funders Network, you have all these people with you, why are you not influencing them more, or steering them more into places where we can make this kind of change that I think we want to see?
Did you try to make Jews obey? Sometimes, and Moses we've been trying since Moses, it doesn't work. So you try to influence people in many different ways. I mean, the Jewish Funders Network is not a prescriptive organization, especially not only because we're not set up like that, because it doesn't work. There's a whole ecosystem of organizations all trying to make Jews give more and get more involved. And there is only so much you can do to convince people. People at some point have to engage with the issue and understand the needs. So my role is not really to force them or compel them to do stuff. I can try, but I'm certainly going to fail, because that's not how people operate in philanthropy. Philanthropy is a voluntary organization, it's a voluntary activity. Giving is voluntary. And folks want to give to what they want to give. My job is to do a little bit judo with what you're saying, meaning I'm not starting from what I want them to do. I'm starting from what they want to achieve in the world. What is your vision? Your vision is a world with rich Jewish engagement. Okay, so let's see what do you need to do in order to get there. It's not me, Andres. I have this, from the top of my ivory tower and my infinite wisdom, I tell them they have to invest in Jewish adult education, right? It's more working with them and trying to understand what is the change you want to do in the world and how can you do it in the most effective way. And part of my job is to hold a mirror to the philanthropic community. And I don't mince words, as you just said. When I try to tell them that, the times in which we live require a much bolder philanthropic community than the ones we have. You have to understand that the natural state of philanthropy is underperformance. Why? Because philanthropy does not have a built-in feedback mechanism. You have a business, you underperform, you go bankrupt. You have a nonprofit, you underperform, you don't raise money, or people don't go to you. You're a doctor, you underperform, your patients die. You're a philanthropist, you make a bad grant, you get a gala in your honor, right? Like there's no built-in feedback mechanism. The IRS will control that your books are in order, but not that your grants are effective. So my job is sometimes to show them, in a loving and sort of empathetic way, because I really love what they do, and I really love the motivation they have and the generosity with which they face the work. But to say, this is how you can be more effective, and this is what the field needs now. Now, then it's up to them to take it or leave it. But one thing that does help, more than what Andres tells them, is what their peers tell them, right? And that's the beauty of the Jewish Funders Network. By being a network, funders influence each other. And the beauty of the interactions that happen at the Jewish Funders Network is that passion is contagious. So take somebody like Harold Greenspan, for example, right? That started PJ Library, and his passion is contagious. And PJ Library now, I don't know what the budget is, but it's humongous. It's big. They serve 500,000 families worldwide. And this is because his passion was contagious. And that was much more effective than a litany of complaints from me.
So I'm curious, by the way, I just want to call out the name of the article or your speech, really, which was Being Decisive in the Face of Uncertainty, which I thought, again, was a phenomenal speech, and I was incredibly inspired to read it. But you do say some pretty damning things in here. You talk about being bolder. You talk about, you basically say that there's three types of relationships that we have to focus on: a relationship with our fellow Jews, a relationship with the outside world, and a relationship with Judaism. Right. I'm just curious. I definitely encourage anyone who's interested in reading or watching, just Google the title that I just gave you. But I'm curious, what was the feedback that you were getting, without naming any specific names? What feedback did you get specifically at the conference from these funders about your speech?
So people, I see the half glass full. So for example, 72% of JFN members gave more in 2021 than in 2020, right? Like, I don't have figures for 2022 yet, but so, listen, people can come after your speech and tell you it was a great speech. The question is not that. The question is, do behaviors change afterwards, right? And a speech, never changes the world. Some might, Martin Luther King's speech may change the world, but we don't live in those times anymore. It's a sustained effort to make, to change attitudes and sort of encourage funders to work in a specific way. But I think that coming out of the pandemic, some signs are really encouraging. Like, as I said, 72% people funders are giving more. 57% of them plan to keep their higher level of giving during the pandemic in the future. A long battle of mine was against the 5% payout rate, right? Like foundations, I don't know where the listeners are, but in the United States, foundations are obliged to give a minimum of 5% of their corporates every year, right? Now, the operating word there is minimum. Now, many funders treat it as the maximum. And I say, 5% is was never supposed to be a ceiling, it was supposed to be a floor. So in times like now, you need to go beyond your 5%. You need a big, bold investment. And I think, I think that sometimes folks buy the notion of having a big idea and invest bold, but they don't really understand how those big ideas develop. They think there is some genius coming up, with a light bulb moment, and it doesn't work like that. It works by listening to the field, by working with others and whatever. So people got it. When I talk about bold investment, moonshots, philanthropic moonshots, people agree. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to get to them. And that's my work going. That's a follow-up work that I have to do.
So I think that's a good point. And I think I'd like to talk about on the moonshot side and not on the funder side for a second, because the funders can get in line and say, I'm ready, with a check in hand or what have you. And there are other resources at their disposal and say, I'm ready to fund or I'm ready to support a moonshot. But if there's no moonshots to support, then it's a two-way street, right? And so, one of the things that I feel in the Jewish world is that we don't really have the moonshotters. We have a lot of really nice projects in many ways, a lot of really nice local, maybe regional, sometimes national. But I haven't seen real innovation in a long time in the Jewish world. And I define real innovation as the follows. It has to achieve, basically in today's day and age, global scale or very, very close to it, has to have widespread consumer adoption, and has to have repeat ongoing engagement. So I think two of those three, a lot of boxes are checked, or a lot of organizations check 2 of the 3 boxes, including like a Birthright, I would say checks 2 of those 3. PJ Library checks 2 out of those 3. A lot of organizations check 2 of those 3. But to check all 3, I haven't seen, except for 2 situations. One is JDate back in the late 1990s, and the other is JSwipe 2013, 2014. Both were acquired by the same publicly traded company, Spark Networks. So I'm wondering if we don't have moonshots in the Jewish world because moonshots rarely exist in the nonprofit space. In fact, the 2 examples I just gave you were private for-profit companies. And I'm wondering if that's part of the issue on the moonshot side, where you're never going to get a true moonshot because nonprofits, by and large, not just in the Jewish world, in the world in general, are not moonshotters, and that's okay. I don't know if
right. I think there's a lot to unpack in what you said. First of all, JDate and JSwipe don't have content. It's a connecting platform, so it's much easier to get there when you're not asking people to change their lifestyles or whatever. I mean, you give them a platform to do what they do in a more efficient way. So it's not really the same. Secondly, not everything needs to be a moonshot. Like Jewish communities sometimes go, oh, now it's everything local and small and startup-y, and now everything has to be a big moonshot like that reaches millions of people. No, there's place for both. Like the fabric of Jewish community, it's done in many cases with small local organizations. So let's relax a little bit. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big proponent of bold, ambitious moonshots, but not everything and everybody has to be involved in one. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, I think that the way to come up with moonshots, let me give you a thing. Before we go there, you talk about moonshots in the nonprofit versus moonshots in the general, corporate world or governmental world. The original term moonshot comes from John F. Kennedy, who said we're going to get to the moon in 10 years. Now, that was a quote unquote easy moonshot. Why? Because it was a technical challenge. It wasn't really an identity challenge. Kennedy wasn't asking Americans to change their behaviors, to like every individual American to do something different or light candles every Friday night. Like it was basically tasking an industrial complex with a technical challenge. The technology had to be developed, but basically existed. And it was basically putting enough effort into it would achieve it. I mean, there was ingenuity. I'm not minimizing. There was ingenuity, creativity, but ultimately it was a technical challenge. It was a technical hurdle that needed to be overcome. You could break down the moonshot of JF Kennedy into a series of technological challenges that with enough research money and manpower, you could. It's very different in the Jewish space or in the nonprofit space. When we're talking about people's identities and changing behaviors, so that's already a built-in difficulty of having moonshots in the Jewish world. The other thing is that it's hard to measure. So the JFK moonshot was, did we land in the moon or we didn't? Right now, I could say it was birthright was a moonshot to get every young Jew to Israel, but did we achieve our goals? What were our goals? More, less assimilation, more engagement with Israel. How do you measure that? It's not so simple. So there's a built-in difficulty in having moonshots for the nonprofit space.
That's my point, is that maybe we should stop looking at the nonprofit space to produce.
Well, but I look at it differently. We call them moonshot because they're very ambitious and because they're deeply transformational, right? And the way to get to them is not, again, by having one moment of illumination and coming up with a moonshot. We get to them through what I call adjacencies. Basically, birthright, which was a moonshot, which said basically we're going to be a very ambitious goal that had a lot of moving parts that had to be put together. But it wasn't an original idea. It was basically an adjacency to the Israel Experience projects that Charles Bronfman had been doing for 30 years. Basically said, wait a second, we have this basis. We have the Israel Experience programs. Listen, I've done an Israel Experience program in 1985, and it wasn't birthright, but, it was part of the process that led to birthright. So the intelligence of communal leaders and philanthropists is to look, what is the adjacency? In other words, we have Israel Experience. Now, what if Israel Experience became free, universal, and more transformational? What do we need to do for that to happen? Right? Take PJ Library. PJ Library was the same story. It was an adjacency. Basically, Harold Greenspan listens to Dolly Parton, who gives books to young children in urban neighborhoods. And he said, well, what if we do the same thing for Jews? Right? So that's one thing. The second thing, so it builds on something that exists. It's not creation out of nothing. The only one that creates out of nothing is God. We create out of stuff that exists. And the second thing is leveraging existing behaviors. When you're talking about changing behaviors, you're always going to find it easier to work with behaviors that already exist. In other words, take PJ Library. People already read books to their children, right? We do. Every parent will read books to their children. What Harold Greenspan says is, you're already reading books, read them a Jewish book, and here's the book. So you're leveraging an existing behavior. So when you break down the moonshot, you're really looking at a series of incremental upgrades to ideas that already exist. Right? When you look at that, it's much easier to come up with moonshots than to say, I got to sit down in a lab and I got to come up with this brilliant idea on my own.
I agree with that. And actually, when you look at innovation, I mean, disruptive innovation, a term that was coined by Clayton Christensen from Harvard University. I mean, he talked about that innovation doesn't mean just inventing something out of nothing. It means taking something that exists, packaging it differently, offering it differently, programming it differently. Like, I'm with you on that. But you talked about two very important points here. One is behavior change, and two is people. And again, I'm looking at behavior change. So I'm, just things that come to mind as you're talking about behavior change. So having people, instead of staying at hotels, what they've been doing all their life, they're now staying at other people's apartments. That's called Airbnb. Having people get into everyone's cars as random people, strangers, growing up, they said never get into a stranger's car. And now you order it on your phone, a stranger comes, picks you up, instead of ordering a taxi or taking another means of transportation, that's called Uber or Lyft. So those are just two examples. I don't know if, those examples again come from the for-profit world, the private sector world. And so I just don't know if nonprofits can affect behavior change, because it's hard for me to think of any examples where that happens. The second thing that you mentioned is people, that, we have to have people thinking about these problems, obviously. But who are these people? What's the quality, the professional quality?
It's not so much, I'll start with the second one. It's not so much people thinking, indeed it's people thinking, but also people observing. Like, in other words, I think that we do a lot of research in the Jewish community, but we don't do enough ethnographic research, meaning we don't go out and observe how Jews live their life. Now, when you observe them, you come up with much better ideas that if you ask them a question. If you observe them and you realize that Jewish teenagers play esports on their computer, 7 hours a day, so you say, so maybe we should Judaize that activity in some way.
Right, I understand that, but that was my point. My point was not what the people are doing, it's the people themselves. And I'm sorry to say this, there's a lot of people that are going to be offended by what I'm about to say, and you might be as well. But you used to work at IBM, okay? Yeah. Adam Lehman from Hillel used to work at, I believe, AOL, okay? Yeah. For every one of you, there are a lot of very, very, very good-hearted people in the Jewish world, what you call Jewish professionals, but they're just not professionally talented enough to solve these big problems. So you can say we need to observe and we need to ethnograph. That's fine. I agree with you. But if the people don't know how to do it in a professional way and then translate that research, as you said, which there's more than enough of, into development, because R&D goes hand in hand, then I think you're asking people to do things that they're just not, frankly, capable of doing. That's an issue.
Now it's my turn to actually offend a lot of people. Having worked in the corporate world, I can tell you that the average intelligence of any corporate executive is pretty low. Like, those people working in a company is 10 times easier than working in the Jewish community. The level of complexity that working in the Jewish organization has is like, listen, I've been at a very young age, a senior manager in an international corporation, and that was much easier in comparison to running the Jewish Federation, because there's a level of personal involvement of people, because everybody in the Jewish community is a stakeholder, because you are subjected to different parameters of success depending on who measures it, because the ideological is mixed with the performance, because the personal is linked with the ideological. It's very, very complicated. Now, of course, if we as a community don't, and that's why I'm one of the leading of the funding board members of Leading Edge, if we as a community don't invest in getting the best talent for the Jewish community, we're going to lose. And in a way, you are right, but that's also a self-fulfilling prophecy. Meaning, you come from the perspective that people working in the Jewish community are not smart, and they work in the Jewish community because they don't have anything to do. So then you're going to pay them less. You're going to pay them less. So you're going to disempower them. So you're going to keep attracting low talent people. The way of cutting that vicious circle is to seriously invest in talent, pay people competitive salaries with the private market, which is something that we do at JFN. At JFN, people make salaries that they would make in the private market, because that I'm competing with, I want the best people, right? And I don't tell them that I don't think they have to be penalized for doing something for the good of the world or for the good of the Jewish people. If we penalize people for going into the nonprofit sector, of course, like, you'd rather be You rather, if you're going to make $100,000 working in a nonprofit and $400,000 working in a corporation, so you don't work in a nonprofit, you work in a corporation and you donate $50,000 a year and you become a big macher, but you're not contributing what you could. So I think that's a complicated statement to make because it has that risk of becoming self-fulfilling, and because it in many cases is objectively not true. There are cases like you can say that my case is good, moving from the corporate sector to the Jewish sector. It was successful, but many people actually failed in the Jewish community, having moved from senior positions in the secular world. I mean, I don't want to name names, but the very high-profile people that went from senior corporate positions to senior Jewish positions, they were very, successful and failed. So, but I wanted to say something completely different about what you're talking about Uber and Airbnb and that.
Yeah.
I think that the behavioral change is kind of different there. It's more of an organizational change, in the sense that companies have realized that in the 21st century, what's important is not to own the product or the service, but to own the platform. And that brings us back to the question of JDET or JSwipe, right? Like the question there is not, what these guys own is the platform. What Uber says, wait a second, if I want to work in transportation, what is the best business in the 21st century? Owning a fleet of cars or owning a platform for hundreds of thousands of people to communicate and find their own rights? Of course, the latter. Now, the problem I find is in the Jewish community, we're still being the hotel and not the Airbnb. We're the taxi owner and not the Uber, meaning a JCC will work very hard on providing a menu of goods and services, of programs, workshops, activities, what have you, when in fact maybe they need to think of themselves as a platform where people can do Jewish and deploy their own creativity. When you're talking about Jewish leaders being incredibly creative, they don't have to be. What they have to do is they have to create the conditions for individual Jews to be creative and be entrepreneurial. What happens, like Jeff, and I'm talking, with knowledge here because Jeff operates like that. I don't come up with the ideas. What I do is I generate a platform where funders can connect and they can come up with they can deploy their creativity and their entrepreneurship in my platform. And that's way more valuable than me trying to come up with all the brilliant ideas, because even if I was extremely bright, which I'm not, I wouldn't be able to replicate the energy or the intelligence that comes from the serendipity of people working together. Jewish organizations need to be spaces for engineered serendipity. Platform, you kind of need to be, you need to create structures where people can create and co-create. Like think about your phone. Your phone, it's only half of it is Apple. All the apps are not Apple. And what makes the iPhone so valuable is that people deploy their apps on the Apple platform, right? So yes, Apple will give you a couple of basic programs, but the richness of your phone is all the stuff that you upload there, right? So in the Jewish community, we're not used to operate like that. So that's why we're less creative, because we try to provide everything. We try to give you an iPhone that has only the programs that we give, instead of saying, here's the platform, come and create. Here's your phone, here's the code, and you can create, apps that will operate in this operating system.
It's a great point, and it's funny that you bring that up, because there was just an article in eJewish Philanthropy about JLive. I'm sure you heard about it.
Yeah.
I actually was going to write a rebuttal, but I'll just use this opportunities, and I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this. So they're building a platform, and kudos to them. It's an interesting niche, but it's a platform. of events, Jewish
Yeah.
events. And what I was going to say is, I said, listen, it's great that you're building this platform. It's serving a niche audience. It's maybe we'll have certain things like certain bells and whistles features that appeal more to the Jewish world than maybe other worlds. But if the events themselves are not good, then the platform's meaningless. And I
Right.
find, what's that?
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out. But the question, but you're looking at it in a very restrictive way, because a platform, if it's good, and that's why I do like JLife. I mean, I think that the platform then takes a life of its own. Meaning, let's say you take JLife, and I don't know if people know what JLife is. It's a platform that it aims to be way more than an event platform. It's sort of and actually the guy who's developing it is a friend, Scott Kaufman. You should invite him to the podcast because he has some very interesting ideas about this. But not to defend a friend, I think that what he's trying to do is very interesting because at the basic level, it's what you say. It's one space. You have all the events, all the Jewish stuff that is happening in a city, and that in and of itself is valuable. Yes, true. That they don't control the quality of the event, but you can't demand that from them. Like you don't. It's like asking the phone book to vouch.
No, I'm not. That's not my point. My point is not that they should. But I just want to finish my point, and I'll give it to you.
Yeah.
My point is not that they should create a filter for what events come on, and they should create some kind of a measurement for what's good and what's not. My point is this: the Jewish world, by and large, puts out subpar events. Okay, and no, that's it's. I've been told
okay, that's a different story. But that's
But let me finish.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying is that you can have this beautiful platform, very user friendly on all the devices you want it. But if the actual content, because you talked about this a few minutes ago, if the actual content, the events in this case, is not good, then people are not going to use the platform because they're not going to want to go and do subpar things. And this is one of the reasons why Jews are less and less engaged, frankly.
Right. The cost of mediocrity in Jewish life is very high, and I agree with you on that. But let me respond to you on two ways. And again, seeing the half glass full. Platforms like JLife can be very useful because let's say you're a user, you have one experience of using it, right? But let's say you're a communal leader and you look at JLife for the city of, say, Muncie, Indiana, right? And you see there are 10 events and there are 10 and they are the same. When I look at the entire menu, it's not creative. I can identify gaps. I can then create connections within the platform. So as a directory, a platform like that is limited. It shows what it is. But as a potential for development and for intelligent planning at the communal level and for exchange and connection between different communal players, the potential is enormous. So at the first
but we've heard that line a million times. Potential is enormous. I mean, come on, at the end of the day, if we don't reach our potential, what does it matter?
Let me finish. I got to get to the quality point in a second. I just want to finish my point about JLife. So I think that platforms like that, for example, Twitter, if you think of Twitter as a platform where people talk, it ended up being something where people posted. Now people like, retweet, connect, create hashtags. The same could happen with JLife or with any other Jewish platform if you set them up as a place where people can be creative on their own. Now that's to finish with the platform thing. In terms of quality, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, if Jewish events are subpar, people are not going to go. My first thing when I was a community planner or planning events or working at the Federation, my first question was to the people proposing an event is, would you go? Would you leave? Is this come before a hot bath and a good book? If it doesn't, just don't do it, right? But here's the half glass full here. I think that the pandemic did a lot of good in terms of quality. Why? because it commoditized quality, right? So what the pandemic did is it flattened the offer of content. So let's say your rabbi, his sermons are not great. Now, during the pandemic, services are in Zoom, and all of a sudden you say, wait a second, if I'm already doing this on Zoom, I'm not limited to my rabbi. I can listen to Shannon Browse or David Wolpe or Elliot Cosgrove, or I can even listen to sermons from Rabbi Sachs, right? So it made so all the stuff that was not quality, you weren't going to do. So I think that we have post-pandemic a window of opportunity. And by the way, the same happened with the secular world. Like if you live in Buenos Aires, for example, you're going to do a virtual tour of a museum. What are you going to do? A virtual tour of the Louvre or a virtual tour of the Facacto Museum of Buenos Aires? You're going to do the Louvre, right? So I think we have a window of opportunity here of people got used to high quality, and high quality became cheap because of the technological tools that we have. So I think that it behooves us, communal leaders, to continue demanding the same quality that we paradoxically had during the pandemic, and to also redefine the roles of communal professionals. Like if my rabbi, let's face it, his sermons, and I'm not talking about specifically my rabbi because I love her and she's amazing, but I'm talking about if for argument's sake, my rabbi is not great at sermons, not a great scholar, not a great public speaker, but he's good at accompanying people, at the pastoral work, at the community building. So don't compete with Sharon Browse. Take Sharon Browse, sermons and help people interact with that high quality content. Don't try to compete with them. Like use that idea of content and high quality content becoming widely accessible to your advantage instead of competing with it. Right?
No, I appreciate that.
So and the same goes with the sharing thing. Like programs like Craigslist and Uber and Airbnb, then they became much more corporate, but it came out of the sharing economy of people sharing stuff, right? It's kind of the same thing. People are sharing, help them do it better, right? And maybe the role of the professional is it has to change. But going back to your question about talent, it's not only that people are smart. People are very smart in the Jewish community. Jewish professionals are some of the smartest people I know. The question is, how is the role defined? Is the role defined as trying to all the time outcompete people that you can't possibly outcompete, or trying to be an aggregator of good things that are happening in the world and curate that for your participants? But if you really find the role like that, you have a much better shot at providing people with good quality.
Absolutely. But again, we come back to this contradiction that we just keep seeing in the Jewish world, where you're saying now we have to share more. Well, we know that Jewish nonprofits, by and large, are not very, as we would say in Hebrew, lo mefagenim. They don't, they're not interested in sharing things that are not directly positive for them.
They have a very Jewish organizations, and there I agree with you. Jewish organizations have a very territorial view of information and of intellectual property. And in my view, that's a mistake. And that's a mistake from their perspective. Not, I think that, sharing is the new owning. Meaning the people that set the parameters of how information is going to be shared, rather than restrict that sharing, are the ones that do better in the new economy. So iPhone could have said, I'm not going to share my operating system with anybody, right? But then if you do that, they don't fully share it, but for argument's sake, if you don't do that, people cannot deploy apps in your phone because they can't program apps for iOS. So Apple will be the porter for not sharing. right? The same with Windows. Like Windows, why is Windows so great? Because people have information. Windows shared with developers information so that they can create programs that run on Windows.
Right, but Andres, you're using examples that are for-profit examples, private sector examples, in which 1+1 = 3. We know that in the for-profit world. In the nonprofit world,
it can't be the same for the
zero-sum.
nonprofit. It can't be the same for the nonprofit world. If you find it right, if a synagogue says, listen, the metaphor is are not perfect, but if a JCC or a synagogue said, we're gonna give you usage of our space. We want to work with we're not going to just share the list of members because you have a right to privacy and all that. But what if there is a way in which we can make sure that people that can offer these members interesting stuff have access to that information? There is a lot of proprietary information about the Jewish community, and some organizations are doing a very good job. So UJA in New York, for example, shares with everybody their Jewish population study. Is a goldmine of information. Now, I think that Jewish community organizations need to understand that, the proverb of lifting the tide, so that, what is it called, raising the tide and lift all boats and whatever. I think that if you start looking at the field and not at your organization, it's going to be hard at the beginning, but everyone is going to win. And ultimately, the funders need to force you to do that. Funders, force is a strong word, but they can encourage you, let's say, to do it with a little bit of stick and carrot approach, meaning they can reward cooperation among organizations, and they can penalize those that don't want to cooperate and don't want to work with others, because ultimately it's their money, and they don't want to duplicate, they don't want to pay twice. So it's totally fine for a funder to say, I want you guys to share information. I want you guys to work together. Maybe not on everything, but maybe in some things that you can share resources.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear that. I mean, we'll put that to bed. I do want to ask you a question about JFN, because, you've been very outspoken about using the pandemic as a launch point to, move into a new era in the Jewish world. I'm just curious, what are some of the things that either you're already doing differently at JFN or that you're planning to do differently, with the pandemic in mind, and what it's enabled?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic was not so much a revolution, but a catalyst. It sort of accelerated processes that were already there. So we just talked about collaboration, for example. During the pandemic, I was sort of hacking the Chainik of collaboration with funders for years, right? Telling people how important it is to collaborate and whatever. The pandemic gave some urgency to that. And then it got people to work together in a way that they wouldn't have if they hadn't feel the urgency that the crisis created. So I think that collaboration is going to be a big thing in the future. And we're investing a lot of resources into that. I think that during the pandemic, more than half of JFN members started funding things that were not their usual niche or their usual mission. And that, I think, it's another window of opportunity for us to leverage, meaning folks are open to fund new things. They're less dogmatic about, so as an example, people that would never fund poverty and human services, they started doing it during the pandemic because the needs were so great. And when you break that taboo of I'm only fund within my Dalet Amot, within my confines, when you break that taboo, so the sky's the limit. You can really, so that's the type of things we're doing. We're investing, to your point before about comparison with the corporate world, we're investing a lot of effort in creating good data. There's no enough data in the Jewish world. There is a lot of data, but the data is not usable. Data systems don't talk to each other. And during the pandemic, it also became evident that you need to know a lot more than we know now. Where Jews live, what are the needs? How is the Jewish family composed? What are the motivations? All that stuff is going to be important. But if you ask me what for me, and here I'm kind of alone, I don't think I'm the only one who thinks about this, but I do think I'm the only one that gives this the level of priority that I think it has. I think that what the foundation with with the pandemic does, it gives urgency to a quest for meaning. I think that people are going to be looking for meaning, for values, for content. After every pandemic, there's a spiritual quest, because it's obvious to understand why, because you have a brush with death, and that immediately puts you in a transcendental state of mind. You start asking yourself for the meaning of stuff. Every trauma, and the pandemic is a global trauma, every trauma, sets you up in a quest for meaning. And after the Black Death, for example, the Reformation was, developed. After the smallpox epidemic in Asia in the 6th century, Buddhism really, sprung up, and it was created before, but it became very popular after that, as people were looking for new spiritual responses to what had happened to them. And I think that in the Jewish community, we're not set up to satisfy that quest for meaning. We don't know enough. We don't reflect enough about questions of meaning and transcendence and theology and ideas. We don't have that. I mean, we're living off outdated ideologies. All the Jewish ideologies, Reform, Chabad, Orthodox, conservative, they're all ideologies of the 19th century. So I think that the pandemic gives urgency to the creation and the development of new ideological avenues for people to find meaning in the world. And that's, and I'm alone on this, but that's the thing that worries me the most, that people are going to look for meaning and they may not find it. They may not find it within the Jewish community.
Couldn't agree with you more. I want to ask you one more question. This is totally off topic from what we've been talking about, but were you aware that Theodore Herzl was contemplating for the state of Israel, of course, Palestine, but also Argentina?
Yeah, of course. It's he wasn't really contemplating it. He basically floated ideas, saying his point was we need a territory. And he threw, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Uganda, whether it's Argentina, I don't care. Now, you have to understand, Argentina in the 1880s, it was like saying Siberia, like literally, like the Patagonia had been just conquered from the Indians. And it was a, completely, humongous expanse of nothing, basically. And so it kind of makes sense, but he said it in that context. Now, interestingly enough, but that, by the way, mention of a remote place as an example gave a lot of grief to Argentinian Jews, because it became a conspiracy theory that the far right uses till this very day, that is called the Plan Andina. It's supposedly, there's supposedly a plan of the Jews to occupy the Patagonia and create a Jewish state, and that's still going around. There's as ludicrous as it is, I mean, still people that firmly believe in the Plan Andina, and actually people that were detained, and kidnapped during the military government, they recall being asked about the Plan Andina. And there's actually one guy, Jacobo Timerman, a very famous journalist, very Zionist too, but very famous in Argentina. His theory is that he was kept alive by the generals because they were thinking of some sort of show trial where they would prove the existence of the Plan Andina. And they were going to uncover sort of the international Zionist conspiracy. It's pretty crazy. So yeah, thank you, Herzl, for that one.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that's a delight to a lot of our listeners. And I know in general that a lot of people don't realize that, there were other Uganda, you mentioned Argentina, of course, Of course, we ended up doing it back in central homeland of.
Well,
of
there
the
was
Jews.
there was one there was actually one in Siberia, Birobidzhan, that still exists. I mean, there was a Stalinist idea of creating a Jewish homeland within the Soviet Union too. There's plenty of ideas like that. Thanks God, the only one that made sense, God created.
Andres, this has been really cool, and I appreciate you doing this. Thank you so much.
Big pleasure.